You think this is funny? Dr. Andrew Collins sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The laughter in the room echoed off the sterile walls of the hospital's break room. Jasmine Williams, the only black nurse on the floor, stood frozen. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't even looking at them. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform. It's just a joke, Jasmine. Lighten up, he added, as if his words could erase the sting of what had just happened. Jasmine had been too focused on the patient in the next room to realize what was happening behind her. She had been trying to do her job, trying to ignore the small but constant insults that came with being the only black nurse in a predominantly white hospital. But today was different. Today, they had crossed the line. Dr. Collins, along with a few other doctors, had decided to prank her. They didn't even ask if she minded. They didn't care about her boundaries, her dignity, or her hard work. They thought it was funny to shave a part of her hair while she was busy with her duties, something that, in their eyes, was just a harmless joke. A joke that had cost them more than they could ever imagine. Jasmine's eyes stung with the urge to cry, but she didn't. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. She had worked too hard for too long to let them see her break. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the awkward silence after the laughter died down. It's just a little fun, one of them said, trying to play it off. Jasmine didn't respond. She simply walked out of the break room, the sound of her shoes clicking against the tile floor louder than any of their excuses. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let them get away with this. She went to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and took a deep breath. She had been holding on to this moment for too long, letting all the little slights slide, but now was the time to stand up. She grabbed her phone and began typing. She had to find a way to make them understand the damage they'd done, to show them that their actions had consequences. The lawsuit would be her answer. $7 million. That would make them see. That would make them listen. Jasmine wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew she couldn't let them get away with this. She couldn't let anyone think they could treat her, or anyone else, like this again. Not without facing the consequences. I woke up the next morning to a flood of messages on my phone. Jasmine stared at the screen, her mind still processing the events from the day before. It had only been a few hours since she had walked out of the hospital, but now, as the sunlight filtered through her bedroom window, it all felt surreal. The anger was still there, burning deep within her, but there was also a sense of calm. She had made a decision. She was going to take action. As she scrolled through the messages, she found one from a close friend who worked at the hospital. I heard what happened. Jasmine, you need to report this. You can't let them get away with this. It was exactly what she needed to hear. Jasmine knew the system wasn't going to change itself. It never did. But maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to make it happen. She took a deep breath and set the phone down. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been humiliated, belittled, and dismissed. This was about standing up to the injustice that people like Dr. Collins thought they could get away with. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the people who had been silenced for too long. As she walked into the living room, she glanced at the calendar on the wall. It had been a month since she started working at the hospital. A month since she had felt that gnawing feeling in her gut every day as she walked through those sterile hallways. A month since she had started wondering if she was truly seen for who she was. Now, she was done wondering. Now, she was going to be seen. She sat at her kitchen table, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as she began drafting her lawsuit. $7 million. It sounded like a lot, but Jasmine knew it was nothing compared to the emotional toll it had taken on her. It was nothing compared to the mental exhaustion of constantly being underestimated. She knew the doctors and administrators at the hospital would try to downplay it. They would try to sweep it under the rug, to make her feel like she was overreacting. But Jasmine was ready. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid. The lawsuit wasn't just about the money. It was about sending a message. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a simple battle. But she had come too far to turn back now. This was her chance to show them that their actions had consequences. As she finalized the document, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was her attorney, a woman named Rachel, who had helped her file a case against a hospital before. Jasmine answered. Rachel, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. I'm ready. The days following Jasmine's decision were a blur. The lawsuit was filed, and soon after, the hospital administration was in full defense mode. They had no idea what they were up against. Jasmine, however, had never been more sure of herself. The moment she had clicked submit on that legal document, everything had changed. She was no longer just the nurse who had to keep her head down. She was the woman who had taken back her power, and she could feel it in her every move. The hospital's PR team immediately went to work, crafting a narrative that painted Jasmine as someone looking to make a quick buck, someone overreacting to a harmless joke. They didn't realize that this wasn't just about money. For Jasmine, this was about being treated with dignity, about not allowing her identity to be diminished any longer. The first public statement came from Dr. Collins himself. He claimed the incident had been a misunderstanding, an unfortunate prank, and that he never intended to hurt Jasmine. But his words didn't have the desired effect. Instead of quieting the storm, they fueled it. The media picked up on it, and soon, Jasmine's name was being spoken everywhere. Some supported her, others doubted her, but none could ignore the courage it took to stand up in a world that often tried to silence people like her. Jasmine spent hours on the phone with Rachel, her lawyer, going over every detail. She knew the hospital would fight hard. They had resources, lawyers, and public relations teams. But Jasmine had something they didn't: truth. Every time she spoke to Rachel, there was a sense of calm in her voice, a quiet strength that came from knowing she was doing the right thing. This isn't just about us, Rachel. It's about everyone who has ever been treated like they don't matter, Jasmine said one afternoon. Rachel was silent for a moment, letting the weight of Jasmine's words sink in. I know, Rachel replied, her voice filled with understanding. This case is bigger than we could have ever imagined. It's not just about your dignity. It's about standing up for those who are too afraid to speak out. The hospital wasn't prepared for what came next. A few weeks later, Jasmine received a call from a former nurse who had worked at the hospital years ago. She wanted to speak out about the toxic work environment, the racial discrimination, and the many instances of mistreatment that Jasmine had faced. The former nurse's story mirrored Jasmine's own. It was clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Jasmine's courage had sparked something, and now, more voices were rising. The hospital tried to contain the damage, but every time they tried to shut one door, another opened. Jasmine could feel the momentum building, not just for her, but for all the people who had been silenced for too long. Her story was becoming a symbol of defiance, a reminder that no one should ever feel less than because of the color of their skin. As the lawsuit progressed, Jasmine started receiving messages from people all over the country, nurses, teachers, students, even executives, who had experienced similar discrimination. They were inspired by her bravery, and many of them had started speaking out too. Jasmine knew that the road ahead would be difficult. She had no illusions about how hard this would be, but she was no longer afraid. She had already taken the hardest step. Now, all she had to do was keep walking. Jasmine sat at her desk late one night, her eyes glued to the glowing screen in front of her. The noise of the office had long since faded, leaving only the hum of her computer and the occasional rustle of paper. It had been weeks since she filed the lawsuit, and while things had quieted down at the hospital, the pressure was mounting in. Other ways, her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "We need to talk," the message read. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before dialing Rachel's number. "Hey, Rachel. What's up?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with the anxiety that had been creeping in over the past few days. "Jasmine, I've been going over the hospital's legal response. They're not backing down. They're trying to bury us under paperwork and delay tactics," Rachel replied, her voice calm but firm. "But I have a plan. We're not backing down either." Jasmine nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. "I knew they wouldn't make it easy," Jasmine said, her tone resolute. "But we're going to win, right?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I believe so," Rachel said. "But it's going to take everything we have. And I need you to stay focused. We can't let them push us around." Jasmine took a deep breath. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but now it felt like the stakes had become higher. The thought of how many others had been in her shoes, silent, unseen, disregarded, kept her going. It was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel inferior in a system that was built to push them down. "I'm in this," Jasmine said, her voice gaining strength. "We're going to make sure they hear us." "That's what I like to hear," Rachel replied. "Now, here's what we're going to do next." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, legal jargon, and endless hours spent preparing for the upcoming court dates. Jasmine was feeling the weight of it all, but there was a fire in her now. Each time she thought about how they had tried to strip her of her dignity, a sense of purpose would flood her, reminding her why she was doing this. The hospital had tried to make the whole thing disappear, but Jasmine wasn't letting that happen. As the case grew more intense, the media's interest only increased. Jasmine found herself being interviewed, her story reaching more people than she ever thought possible. It was no longer just about a single incident. It was about changing the way people saw each other, about showing the world that no one, no matter their race, their job, or their background, should ever be treated with disrespect. But it wasn't just the media that was taking notice. Jasmine started receiving messages from other healthcare workers, women, and minorities who had faced similar situations. They told her their stories of being overlooked, belittled, and discarded by a system that was supposed to support them. Many of them had never spoken out. Jasmine knew that her fight was no longer just for her own justice. She was giving a voice to everyone who had been silenced for too long. One afternoon, Jasmine sat down at her desk and reviewed the case documents once more. The hospital had made their first offer, a settlement. It was far less than what she had asked for, and it didn't come close to addressing the emotional toll of what she had endured. They thought they could buy her silence. Jasmine knew better. She knew the real price of her dignity. She picked up her phone and dialed Rachel. "We're not taking the settlement," Jasmine said, her voice steady. "We're going all the way." "I was hoping you'd say that," Rachel replied. Jasmine smiled, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. This was the beginning of the real fight, and she was ready. She was no longer the woman who had been humiliated and ignored. She was the woman who was going to make them listen, and she wasn't stopping until justice was served. Jasmine sat in the small conference room. The walls felt too close, too tight around her as her eyes scanned the stack of papers in front of her. It was the day of the big meeting, and the pressure was starting to hit her in waves. She had already made the decision to go all the way with the lawsuit. There would be no backing down now. Across from her sat Rachel, who had been by her side through every step of this process. The two of them had worked tirelessly to build the case, and now, it was time to face the people who had once tried to humiliate Jasmine, the people who had believed their privilege would shield them from consequences. Rachel's eyes met Jasmine's, her calm presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions Jasmine was feeling. "We're ready," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm. "You've done the hard part. Now we just need to keep pushing forward." Jasmine nodded, though her heart raced in her chest. She knew the challenge ahead was monumental. It wasn't just the lawsuit, it was the fight for her dignity, for the dignity of every person who had ever been made to feel invisible. They had already rejected the settlement offer from the hospital. It was low, far too low, and it didn't even begin to acknowledge the years of disrespect and discrimination she had endured. The hospital's legal team thought they could scare her into submission. They thought they could win with their wealth, their influence, and their power. But they had underestimated one thing. Jasmine was no longer afraid. She had nothing left to lose. As she sat there, going over the evidence with Rachel, the door to the room opened, and in walked two of the hospital's top lawyers. They were older, more seasoned, their faces confident and polished. Jasmine knew these were the people who were going to try to break her. But she didn't flinch. She had already faced down their arrogance once, and she wasn't about to back down now. The lawyers sat down across from her, their eyes cold, calculating. "Miss Williams," one of them said, "we hope you realize this is a serious matter. The hospital does not take kindly to these accusations. We are prepared to go to trial if necessary." Jasmine didn't look away. "I'm prepared as well," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Very well," he said. "We hope this doesn't drag on longer than it has to. But let me make one thing clear. This is not going to be as simple as you think." Jasmine could feel the weight of his words, but it didn't intimidate her. It only fueled her resolve. "I'm not here to make it simple," she said, her tone sharp now. "I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions." The room fell silent for a moment, tension hanging in the air. The lawyers exchanged glances, but Jasmine didn't break her gaze. She could feel Rachel's steady presence beside her, a silent reminder that they were in this together. Finally, the lawyers spoke again, their voices more measured. "You have no idea what you're up against," One of them said, "This will be a long, expensive battle, and you'll be under constant scrutiny." Jasmine took a deep breath, her mind racing through the events of the last few weeks. She had received countless messages of support, texts, emails, even phone calls from people who had experienced similar discrimination in their own lives. Nurses, teachers, office workers, and students. People who had been silenced for too long. People who had been afraid to speak out. But now, they were watching her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for them. "I'm ready," Jasmine said quietly, her voice filled with the strength that had been building inside her for weeks. "I'll face whatever comes, because I know what I'm fighting for." The lawyers exchanged one final look, their expressions unreadable. Jasmine sat back in her chair, feeling a quiet sense of empowerment wash over her. They were trying to intimidate her, but what they didn't understand was that she had already won. She had found her voice, and no matter what happened next, she was never going to be silent again. Jasmine stood in front of the courthouse, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The cool morning air seemed to pause with her, holding its breath as if the world itself was waiting for what would come next. Today wasn't just about her case. It wasn't just about the hospital or the doctors who had thought they could humiliate her without consequence. Today was about everything she had fought for, her dignity, her voice, and the countless others who had silently endured what she had. As she walked through the doors of the courthouse, the buzz of the media was almost deafening. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Jasmine kept her focus. She wasn't here for them. She was here for justice. She had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment. Every deposition, every witness statement, every phone call had brought her closer to this. The hospital had been relentless in their attempts to bury the truth, but Jasmine wasn't backing down. As she entered the courtroom, she felt the familiar tension in her chest, but there was something different now. She wasn't just walking into a fight she didn't choose. She was walking into a battle she had already won in her heart. She took her seat, the legal team from the hospital sitting across from her, their eyes never meeting hers. They had their strategies, their plans, their wealth. But Jasmine had something they couldn't buy. She had the truth. The trial began, and Jasmine listened as the lawyers for the hospital tried to discredit her. They painted her as an overreacting employee, as if the humiliation she had suffered was just part of the job. But with every word they spoke, Jasmine felt her resolve harden. She wasn't going to let them make her feel small again. She wasn't going to let them win. Her lawyer, Rachel, stood up to present their case. She spoke with conviction, her words clear and sharp, cutting through the defenses the hospital's team had set up. Rachel reminded the jury of the damage that had been done, not just to Jasmine, but to every person who had faced similar disrespect and discrimination. As Rachel spoke, Jasmine felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't alone in this fight. Rachel wasn't just a lawyer. She was a partner, a fighter, someone who truly understood the stakes. The day wore on, each testimony pulling the jury closer to the truth. But it wasn't until Jasmine herself took the stand that the room seemed to pause. The air in the courtroom shifted as Jasmine stood and faced the jury. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was ready to tell her story, to make them see her not as a victim, but as someone who had taken control of her life and her future. "I didn't ask for this," Jasmine began, her voice steady, carrying the weight of everything she had endured. "I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be forced to speak out. But what happened to me, what happened to all of us, it matters. And I'm not going to let anyone treat me like I don't deserve respect ever again." The courtroom was silent as Jasmine spoke, her words cutting through the air. She talked about the humiliation, the silent moments of feeling unseen, and the courage it took to file the lawsuit in the first place. She talked about how, every day, she fought to prove that she was worth something in a world that tried to tell her otherwise. "I'm here because I matter," Jasmine said, her eyes meeting those of the jury. "And I'm here because no one should ever be made to feel less than because of who they are." The silence in the room was palpable. Jasmine's words had struck a chord, and for the first time in a long while, she felt heard. The rest of the trial passed in a blur, but Jasmine knew, deep down, that her fight wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about making sure that, for once, the people who had always been ignored would finally be seen. And no matter what happened next, that truth would never change. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours. Jasmine sat in the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing. She had told her story, and now it was in the hands of the 12 strangers who would decide her fate. The room was quiet, the only sound the occasional shuffle of papers as the lawyers exchanged glances. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. She had never been more nervous in her life, but there was something different now. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing tall, about holding her ground in a world that had tried to push her down. Outside the courthouse, the sky was darkening, the setting sun casting a pale light over the building. Jasmine looked out the window, her thoughts drifting back to the moment she had first walked into the hospital, unsure of herself, trying to blend into the background. She had been so focused on fitting in, on not drawing attention to herself, that she hadn't realized just how much of herself she had given away. The case had forced her to confront everything. The microaggressions, the dismissals, the casual racism that had become part of her everyday life. She had spent so long holding her tongue, but now, she could finally speak. She could finally be heard. It felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders, but it was also terrifying. Jasmine glanced over at Rachel, who was sitting quietly beside her, waiting for the verdict. Rachel's presence was like a beacon, steady and unwavering. She had been with Jasmine every step of the way, guiding her through the legal battles, helping her understand every move, every word. Jasmine didn't know how she would have gotten through this without Rachel's support. She turned back to the window, watching as the world outside moved on, oblivious to the battle that was being fought just a few feet away. But Jasmine knew that the outcome of this trial would ripple far beyond these walls. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel inferior. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through what she had. The courtroom door swung open, and the judge entered, signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. The moment had come. She stood up slowly, her legs a little unsteady, and walked with Rachel to the front of the room. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Jasmine's eyes searched their expressions, looking for any sign, any hint of what was to come. The foreman of the jury stood up, holding the piece of paper with the verdict. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff," he said, his voice clear and firm. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. After all the waiting, all the uncertainty, the verdict was finally in. She had won. She had stood her ground, and now, the hospital would have to face the consequences. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Jasmine didn't hear any of it. She felt a wave of emotion rush through her, relief, pride, and an overwhelming sense of justice. It wasn't just about the money, though. The victory was so much more than that. She had fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as less than, who had ever been dismissed or ignored. She had won her dignity back. As Jasmine walked out of the courtroom, she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and strength. She knew that the battle wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still voices to be heard, but for now, Jasmine allowed herself to feel proud. She had done it. She had taken back control of her story. The days following the verdict felt like a dream to Jasmine. She had won, but the victory was different than she had expected. It wasn't just the courtroom battle that had mattered. It wasn't the money either. It was the feeling of having been seen, of having stood up for herself in a world that had often told her she wasn't enough. She walked through the halls of the hospital now, and the air felt different. It wasn't the same oppressive weight of silence that had followed her for so long. People were talking, and for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she was part of the conversation. The nurses, the staff, even the doctors, everyone seemed to be watching her, some with newfound respect, others still unsure how to react. Jasmine smiled to herself. It didn't matter. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had done this for herself. The next few weeks were full of change. Jasmine returned to her work, but it wasn't the same. She walked into the break room one day to find a small group of nurses gathered around the coffee machine. One of them, a woman named Kelly who had always been friendly but distant, smiled at her. "I just wanted to say thank you," Kelly said, her voice sincere. "You did something for all of us. For everyone who's ever felt small in this place." Jasmine blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected this. "I didn't do it for you," she replied, her voice steady. "I did it for me. But I'm glad if it helps anyone else." Kelly nodded, her smile widening. "It's just, you stood up when no one else would. That takes courage." Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never thought of herself as courageous. She had always just done what needed to be done. But now, standing here in the break room, hearing Kelly's words, she realized that maybe, just maybe, courage wasn't about doing something extraordinary. It was about doing something that needed to be done, no matter how hard it was. Later that day, she received an unexpected call. It was from a reporter who had been following the case. "Jasmine, we've been trying to get in touch with you for a while," the reporter said. "We'd love to do an interview with you. Your story has inspired so many people, and we think it needs to be heard." Jasmine hesitated. She had already told her story in the courtroom. She had already fought her battle. But something inside her stirred. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe there were still people out there who needed to hear this story. "All right," Jasmine said, her voice firm. "I'll do the interview." The interview was scheduled for the next day, and Jasmine spent the evening preparing. She thought about what she wanted to say, about the message she wanted to send. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, everyone who had ever been silenced. The next day, she sat in front of the camera, her heart racing as the lights were adjusted and the microphone was clipped to her shirt. The reporter asked her to tell her story, and Jasmine did. She spoke about the incident, about the humiliation she had faced, but she also spoke about the courage it took to stand up, the courage it took to say enough. "I want people to know," Jasmine said, her voice steady, "that you don't have to take it. You don't have to let anyone make you feel small. No matter what the world says, you matter. Your voice matters. And if we all stand together, we can change things." When the interview ended, Jasmine felt lighter, freer than she had in years. It wasn't about the fame or the recognition. It was about the message. It was about giving others the strength to speak up, just as she had. She knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would still be challenges, still moments of doubt, but Jasmine was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. As she left the studio, the reporter's words echoed in her mind. "You've started something, Jasmine. Don't stop now." And Jasmine knew she wouldn't. Jasmine walked into the hospital on a crisp morning, her steps purposeful, her head held high. The air around her felt different now, lighter somehow. The victory in court had shifted something in her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just someone who had survived the relentless, subtle battles of discrimination. She was a symbol of change, a reminder that standing up for yourself could ripple out and impact others. As she entered the break room, she saw a few of her colleagues gathered, their conversation stopping as soon as she walked in. There was a moment of silence, but it didn't feel oppressive like it once did. Instead, it felt like a quiet acknowledgement. Jasmine smiled softly, nodding at the group before making her way to the coffee machine. "Hey, Jasmine," Kelly said, her voice warmer than usual. "We just wanted to let you know we're behind you." Jasmine turned, her heart fluttering slightly. "Thanks," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I appreciate it." It was a small gesture, but it meant more than words could express. Jasmine had no illusions about what the hospital had been like, but these small moments of change, these small acts of solidarity, were proof that things could shift. She wasn't alone anymore. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, a few more nurses came up to her, giving her quiet nods of approval. Some even offered words of encouragement. For the first time, Jasmine didn't feel like an outsider. It was subtle, but it was there. Her work continued, but it was no longer filled with the same undercurrent of tension. She had earned respect, not through her position, but through her actions. And the ripple effect of her lawsuit had begun. Later that week, Jasmine found herself sitting in a meeting with a few senior staff members. She had been asked to attend to discuss her future at the hospital, and though she wasn't sure what to expect, she walked in with the same calm confidence that had carried her through the trial. "Jasmine," Dr. Collins began, his tone more reserved than it had ever been before. "We wanted to take a moment to speak with you about your role here." Jasmine met his eyes, her expression neutral. "What about it?" "We understand that the situation was difficult," he said, his words awkward, as though he was carefully choosing each one. "And we want to assure you that we are committed to creating a more inclusive and respectful environment moving forward." Jasmine didn't say anything at first. She had heard this type of apology before, empty, devoid of any real understanding. But this time, something felt different. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice calm. "But actions speak louder than words." There was a moment of hesitation, but Dr. Collins nodded. "We know. That's why we're going to be implementing new training and policies to address issues of discrimination. Your case has made us realize that we have a lot of work to do." Jasmine listened, her gaze never wavering. This wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't going to be solved by a few training sessions. But it was a step, and steps were what made change possible. As she left the meeting, she felt a strange sense of closure, but also something more, a quiet, resolute hope. Things weren't perfect. There was still so much to be done, but Jasmine had made her mark. The fight wasn't over, but it had started something that couldn't be undone. She had made them see her. She had made them see all of the people who had been hidden in the shadows for so long. And as she walked through the halls of the hospital, her steps felt a little lighter, her heart a little fuller. She was ready for whatever came next, because now, she knew that her voice would always be heard.